Aristotle's philosophical framework, specifically his ideas about essence and his account of change moving towards a fixed end, telos, generates the intellectual architecture of the closed society, whether Aristotle intended this or not. Hi, welcome to Notions of Progress, the show that traces ideas of progress from antiquity to the age of AI. In the last 3 episodes, we spent with Matt Ehret following his argument that the history of progress is a struggle between 2 competing visions of civilization, one that builds and one that extracts. At the end of that argument was a framework you may remember from episode 11, the open system versus the closed system. An open system, on Ehret's account, develops its internal capacities. A closed one manages and depletes their capacities. That framework raised a question we set aside at the time. What exactly is being opened or closed? What is the standard by which we judge whether a civilization is developing or declining? What does it mean to say that a human being or a society is flourishing? This, by very nature, is a concept of progress. Aristotle had an answer, and it begins with a question most of us stopped asking a long time ago. What is a human being for? In this episode, we are going to work through 3 ideas. First, how Aristotle understands the relationship between activity and the good. Second, what he means by telos, the end or purpose internal to a form of life, and why it is grounded in nature rather than a sign from the outside. And third, a challenge we will carry into part 2, posed by Karl Popper about whether any fixed account of human ends is compatible with an open society. 3 terms will carry the argument today. The first is telos, from the Greek meaning end or purpose. According to MacIntyre's reading of Aristotle, the telos of a thing is the end that it is internal to its form of life. What it means for a thing of that kind to be functioning well. A telos it's not a goal you choose. It is whether you are oriented toward virtue of what you actually are. The second, Eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but more precisely, to flourish. For Aristotle, Eudaimonia is the full realization of what human beings are capable of, what they can become. It is a life lived well, not a feeling we are trying to produce. The third term is phronesis, which translates to practical wisdom. We will name it here and return to it in depth in part 2, and in our upcoming episode with Professor Atif Ansar, where I will do real work. For now, phronesis is the capacity to judge well in particular situations. It is how telos meets the world. The question of what a human being is sounds like an ancient idea, and it well may be, but it has not gone away. When we design institutions such as hospitals, schools, and cities, we are making assumptions about what well-being consists in. We are assuming, at least implicitly, that there is something it means for a human life to be going well rather than going badly. Aristotle's argument is that these assumptions need to be examined. They can't be left implicit. The episodes ahead will test whether they can indeed be grounded. Aristotle himself opens the Nicomachean Ethics, his work, not with a principle or a commandment, but with an observation. Every activity, every inquiry, every pursuit aims at some kind of good. Archery aims at hitting the target, for example, or medicine aims at health. Strategy aims at victory. Politics, and this is the one that Aristotle cares the most about, aims at the good of the community. The claim is not yet a claim about the fundamental nature of things. It is a description of how human activity works. On Aristotle's account, we are purposive creatures. We act towards ends. The question he then asks is whether there is a highest good, one that orders and makes sense of all the others. Alasdair MacIntyre, in After Virtue, his very well-known work on Aristotle, frames this as the foundational move of the Aristotelian tradition, where Enlightenment moral philosophy, on MacIntyre's account, begins from rules, what should I do and why should I obey? Aristotle, conversely, begins from character. What kind of person should I become? What does it mean for a human being to be living well? So the key here is the shift from virtue to rule following, MacIntyre argues, is the defining mark of what went wrong in modern ethics. Rules without a prior account of what human beings are for cannot carry the moral weight we ask of them, he claims. MacIntyre makes this point with characteristic directness. Aristotle takes himself not to be inventing an account of the virtues, but to be articulating what is already implicit in thought. He is not constructing a system from first principles. He is giving rational form to what the best practice already assumes. MacIntyre walks through Aristotle's arguments against the rival candidates for the highest good. Money, he claims, is always pursued for the sake of something else. It is never a final end, a final good. Honor depends on the opinion of others. What it means cannot be the good in itself. Additionally, pleasure accompanies successful activity, but it does not constitute it, meaning that pleasure is not a good in itself, according to this model. The name Aristotle gives to the highest good, the overarching good, is Eudaimonia. The translation is genuinely difficult, but it roughly equates to something along the lines of flourishing. This is an important concept, and MacIntyre suggests that we think of it as being well and doing well, a state in which a person is both in good condition and acting from that condition. So what does eudaimonia consist in? Well, MacIntyre, reading Aristotle carefully in this point, distinguishes two senses of the relationship between means and ends. This is the heart. In one sense, means and end are separable. You could achieve the same end by different means. But MacIntyre argues that for Aristotle, the virtues, courage, justice, practical wisdom, temperance, are not related to eudaimonia in that way. What constitutes a complete human life lived at its best already includes the exercise of these virtues. So in other words, this isn't the pathway. This is already part of how they operate. They are, in MacIntyre's reading, partly constitutive of the end. They are, in MacIntyre's reading, partly constitutive of the end, not merely instrumental to it. So what MacIntyre's reading of Aristotle turns on is this. The question of how to live well cannot be separated from the question of what kind of a person to be. The two are one and the same. The highest good is not a target you hit by the right sequence of actions, therefore. It is a form of life that you inhabit through the cultivation of character. One of the most persistent problems in reading Aristotle is a misreading that often occurs. Scholars who have spent careers defending Aristotle's account of Telos, including Philippa and Alasdair MacIntyre, often begin by addressing a suspicion that attaches itself to the concept almost automatically. And it goes like this, that any fixed account of what human beings are for must be at bottom a blueprint of control. So this is their interpretation of how people misinterpret Aristotle. And it turns into a suspicion. The suspicion runs like this. If there is a fixed end built into human nature, they claim that this is Aristotle's motives, then someone, a philosopher, a priest, a state, must be in a position to specify and enforce it. So both Foote and MacIntyre both argued that this suspicion, however, though understandable, rests on a fundamental confusion on their part about how this kind of evaluation actually works. Understanding that confusion is the work of this section. Philippa Foote, in her work Natural Goodness, provides an account of how this kind of evaluation works. Her argument starts with a simple example. When we say that a wolf is defective because it cannot run, We're not imposing an external standard onto the wolf. We're recognizing something about what a wolf is, the essence of that wolf. So what it needs to do to live and flourish as a wolf. The evaluation is grounded in the natural form of life of the species. So a wolf with defective legs is, in perfectly straightforward sense, a bad wolf, not because we disapprove of it, but because it is failing to be what a wolf characteristically is and does. So Foote extends this logic to human beings. What counts as a good human life is similarly grounded in what human beings are, their characteristic form of life, their natural ends. And this is Aristotle's telos argument made in the language of contemporary philosophy, without the theological premises and without appeal to medieval frameworks. So Foote's argument is that the old objection, you cannot derive what ought to be from what is, does not apply to evaluations of living things. Saying what a member of a natural kind needs in order to function well on her account it's like a factual claim. So at this point, we need to make a distinction that will prevent serious misunderstanding, one that has given some of the most influential criticism of Aristotle, including the one we are about to examine. So Aristotle holds in his work Eudaimonia that the intellect begins without innate content. So this is a term we're going to introduce here that you've heard before. What he's saying is the mind at birth is like a writing tablet on which nothing has been inscribed. This is often referred to as Aristotle's idea of tabula rasa. All knowledge, he claims, comes through the senses and is built up through experience. This is Aristotle's account of how we come to know things, our epistemological path. But there's an important distinction to note here. His account of how we come to know things is not the same as his account of what we are. That's where the confusion often creeps in. The claim that human beings have a telos, a natural end internal to their form, is not a claim about what we are born knowing. It is a claim about what we actually are. A blank state in terms of knowledge is entirely compatible with the determinate natural form. So we often hear about the acorn does not know it's going to become an oak tree, but it is nonetheless going to become an oak tree. In MacIntyre's reading of Aristotle, the form of the human good is not what we are born knowing. It is what Aristotle holds we are oriented towards by virtue of what we are. So by treating Aristotle's openness about how we come to know things as license for the conclusion that human nature is in itself plastic and endlessly revisable, that is, according to MacIntyre, the root error in some of the most influential criticisms of Aristotelian ethics. MacIntyre's entire defense of Aristotle depends on keeping these two things absolutely separate. We need to keep that in mind when we turn to our last person, our last theorist, Karl Popper. What Foote and MacIntyre both argue is that the telos is not a specification imposed from the outside. It is on their reading of Aristotle, the internal logic of a form of life, what it means for a thing of that kind to be functioning well. The blank state is about how we come to know. This is back to the tabula rasa. So these things have to be understood in a separate way. The human form is about what we are, not what we know. Well, here's what Karl Popper charges. In his well-known work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1945, he directs a sustained and serious argument against Aristotle. Popper is not a careless thinker, and his charge is not that Aristotle was a bad person or he had authoritarian intentions. The charge is structural, specifically his ideas about essence and his account of change moving towards a fixed end, telos, generates the intellectual architecture of the closed society, whether Aristotle intended this or not. So you hear what Popper's saying here. He's basically saying that because of the acorn and the oak tree example that we discussed, he sees this as an architect, which describes a closed society, which is what Popper is arguing against. At the center of Popper's argument is Aristotle's concept of telos, the very idea that we've been working with in this episode, that every developing thing carries within itself the seed of what it is moving towards. So Popper's argument is in chapter 11 is that this concept, however innocent it may appear in Aristotle's account of nature and biology, becomes politically dangerous when taken by others and when applied to peoples, nations, and states. So Popper's argument runs as follows. For Aristotle, change is the realization of potentialities already present in a thing's inner nature, of what we are. The form or essence of a developing thing stands at the end of its development, not at the beginning. And this generates what Popper identifies as three ideas that later on Hegel will later inherit and push to their extreme. First, that we can only know a thing's inner nature through its historical development. Second, that development reveals a destiny that once there was from the beginning, a kind of inescapable, essential fate. And third, that the inner nature must unfold through change to become fully real, which means that self-assertion and the drive to realize one essential nature become the fundamental categories of both personal and political life. Well, the political implication on Popper's reading is significant. If a person or a state has a hidden inner nature that history is in the process of realizing, then political institutions can claim to be the instruments of that realization. So this is very interesting, right? Because here he's describing a built-in script, a powerlessness, if you will, of these political institutions for something that's unfolding its own destiny. And a claim of that kind is not easily subject to democratic revision. So it's very difficult for people to refute when presented. You cannot vote against what history requires. That's his basic argument. You cannot reform what essence demands. The closed society, therefore, for Popper, is one in which political authority insulates itself from criticism by just appealing to a necessity that transcends ordinary deliberation. Aristotle's Telos, then, on Popper's account, is where the insulation begins. And Popper's charge is serious, and it deserves to be taken seriously. MacIntyre, as we will see in part 2, argues that Popper has misread the relationship between telos and political authority in Aristotle. So this goes back to what we were talking about, that there's a separation between what we are and how we learn. And this is essentially what he believes, what MacIntyre believes, that Popper is conflating. Telos, on MacIntyre's reading, provides the standard by which political arrangements are judged, but not the authority that exempts them from judgment. The tradition that runs from Aristotle through Aquinas generates natural law as a constraint on political power, a standard against which rulers can be found wanting. But we'll talk more about that in episode 2. For now, the charge stands as the question the episode is organized around. And it goes like this. Can a fixed account of human ends of telos be compatible with an open society? And is Aristotle's telos the kind of fixed account that Popper thinks it is? Popper's charge is not answered in part 1. It is posed a question, and in part 2, and we will address it. It is a genuine question, and it is not easily dismissible. So, in closing, what this episode has traced through MacIntyre's and Foote's reading of Aristotle is a framework built on a single foundational claim, that there is such a thing as human form of life, and that living well means realizing that form of life. Aristotle begins with the observation that every activity aims at some kind of good, and whether there is a highest good that makes the others intelligible, this is his claim. He identifies that good as what he defines as eudaimonia. It's not a feeling to be produced, but a form of life to be lived. And he grounds it in an account of human nature, what a human being is for internal to the form of life of that species. So what the episode has also drawn is a distinction that will matter going forward. Aristotle's account of how we come to know things holds that the mind begins without innate content. This is a repeat of what we discussed before, the Tabula Rasa. His account of what we are holds that human nature is not therefore blank or infinitely malleable. Those are things that are claims at two completely different levels. The first does not undermine the second, as Popper claimed. And we've introduced Popper's charge that Aristotle's idea about essence and fixed ends generate the intellectual architecture for the closed society, which he sees as a very dangerous thing, especially following the events of World War II. In part 2, we will ask whether Aristotle's account means for practical wisdom, for the capacity to judge well in particular situations, and whether MacIntyre's defense of Aristotle against Popper can actually be sustained. The question the series keeps returning to over and over is whether progress itself requires a prior account of what we are progressing towards. So that's the question about telos. Aristotle thinks it does, and he thinks he knows what that account looks like. Part 2 will be out in 2 weeks. The sources for both episodes, the Nicomachean Ethics, MacIntyre's After Virtue, and Philippa Foot's Natural Goodness and Popper's Open Society are all in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening today. We look forward to seeing you the next time. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find Notions of Progress on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And all the sources, reading recommendations, and further context for every episode are in the show notes. If you are enjoying this series, liking the episode on YouTube and signing up for the newsletter at notionsofprogress.com really helps more people find these ideas. For those who want to go even deeper, the Curator's Flame blog and Substack newsletter accompany each episode with the questions the scholarship leaves open. I'm Marshall, tracing ideas of progress from antiquity to the age of AI and leaving the debates open for you to consider. Until next time.